Welcome. What follows is a short presentation on how to effectively select quotations to bring into an academic essay in W130 and W131. The first thing to remember when you're choosing a quote is that you want to really be thoughtful about it. You want to avoid just bringing a quote into your paper to fill up space because it's a requirement. It should be a thoughtful process where you're thinking about what the quote will add to your essay. To begin this process, the first thing to do is to make sure you understand the quote and the passages that surround it. One of the quickest ways to derail the overall success of an essay is to pull a quote into your writing and then misinterpret or misconstrue the meaning of the quotation. So you want to make sure you examine the language, the words and ideas in the quote. Look up anything that's unfamiliar to you to avoid misinterpreting. Um, then you want to go back and reread the passages or paragraphs that surround your quote and make sure you understand exactly what's going on in the essay at the time of the quote. Again, the main objective here is to avoid misconstruing or misinterpreting the author's ideas, the original idea that the author was trying to get across when they provided the quotation itself. Once you're pretty confident that you understand the meaning of the quote, you can think about its overall value and what it adds to your essay and whether it will support your argument. One surefire way to feel confident that you've selected a quote that's meaningful is if you find a quote that defines a key term. So, key terms, as you've likely learned already, are big ideas, themes, main concepts in an essay. If you have a quote that defines a key term, you can be fairly confident you've got something useful you can mobilize and discuss to forward your own argument. Uh, Another thing you can consider is whether the quote provides a compelling example. So many of the essays that we draw upon in first year writing classes use stories from the real world, from people's lives. So often in these cases, you'll summarize some of the background information, tell your reader about the story a little bit, but maybe there's a quote in the middle of that story in the original text that seems particularly relevant or useful or eye opening. That might be a good reason to pull a quote into your own writing. If the quote works with your thesis, that's another good reason to potentially select it and pull it into your own writing. So your thesis is the main idea, argument, or claim that your essay is working to defend. So if you have a sense of what the main point of your essay will be already, and you've got a quote that you know works with that main idea pretty obviously, that's another good reason to select a quotation. Lastly, you can consider whether the quote is unpackable, and in the slides that follow, we'll talk a little bit about what that means. Essentially, unpackable means that you can take apart the language of the quote and explain to your reader what the words and ideas mean when you consider them in pieces. If you have a good quote, you should be able to say at least 3 different things about it in your own words. So this is a good test. If you get to the interpretation step, you're looking to analyze what's happening in the quotation itself, and you can't say anything new about it in your own words, then you likely haven't selected a very useful quote. You want to go back to the text and reconsider it and potentially pull in a different quote. To unpack or analyze a quote, you want to ask yourself journalistic staple questions. Who, what, when, where, why, how. Again, making sure you understand the quote and the passages around it, and you're really very cognizant of the details. So you're looking at the nuances, the words and ideas in the text that help to convey the overall meaning. You want to be very attentive to the author's word choice. You're looking for repetitions, contradictions, and similarities, both within the quote and in comparison with other texts. Then lastly, you will look for words or ideas that are important or particularly relevant to your argument. These are likely the words and ideas you'll want to emphasize when you interpret the quotation, so you can get the reader to understand the aspects of the quote that are most relevant and useful to your overall argument. Here's an example. So this comes from Gregory Mancios' essay class in America from one of the 130 textbooks, Rereading America. And here we've selected the first line in the second paragraph here. So let's see what happens, keeping in mind we want to try to say 3 different things about this quotation in our own words. Here we've got the introduction and integration steps already set up. So keep in mind that anytime you pull a quotation into your own writing, you want to frame it using the 3 I's: introduce, integrate, interpret. And that framework is discussed in detail in another video presentation. Here we've already got our quote set up. We've introduced and integrated it, and we're going to work on the interpretation step. So it says, Mancios writes about inequality and the nature of class division in the United States. He suggests that part of the reason for inequality is rooted in the fact that Americans in general don't like to talk about class. When we get to the interpretation step here, we discover it's very difficult to say something new about this quote. All we can really do is say, yes, this is true. Americans really don't like to discuss class or inequality, or no, it's not true. We talk about class and inequality all the time. Keep in mind that we want to avoid qualitative judgments of this nature. When we get to this interpretation step, one of the things you want to avoid as a writer is simply saying, yes, this is a good quote, yes, this is a true quote, or no, this is a bad quote, no, this quote's untrue. So again, we don't want to make judgments about quality. Instead, we want to examine the words and ideas in the quotation. Here, there's just not much detail to work with. There's nothing to unpack. So we likely need to return to the text and try a new quote. Okay, so this in mind, I kept reading for a little bit, and I found a quote on a subsequent page that says something similar to our original idea, but we get more detail and additional language to unpack. So we're going to work with this last sentence in the first paragraph above. You can see next to the big red arrow. In this case, we kept the introductory sentence the same and only altered the integration slightly. Now we want to see if we can come up with 3 things of our own to say about this quote. So here we said, Mancios writes about inequality and the nature of class division in the United States. He suggests that issues of this nature are largely ignored because in politics, in primary and secondary education, and in the mass media, formulating issues in terms of class has been considered culturally unacceptable, unnecessarily combative, and even un-American. So the first thing we can do is emphasize the idea about culture in the middle of the quotation. So he says that part of the reason that we don't talk about class in America is because we've been sort of trained to think that talking about class is culturally unacceptable. So when we emphasize that aspect of the quote, we could say, Mancios suggests that our culture conditions us to ignore inequality and avoid discussing class openly, and essentially trains us to believe that discussions related to class inequality are not acceptable in polite society. So you can see how we even borrowed some of the specific ideas from the original quotation, but we took that language apart in much more detail. So instead of just saying, Mancios says that discussing class is culturally unacceptable, we used the word culture. We talked about how it's not acceptable, but we examined this in much more detail, this specific aspect of the quotation. Second, we might emphasize the ideas about our cultural institutions that encourage us to ignore class division. So he talks about politics, education, and the media, and we borrow these ideas and bring them down into our interpretation. Mancios describes how our political and educational systems and even the media ignore or trivialize class issues and make it seem normal to avoid class-related discussions. So again, we focused on the specific ideas in the beginning of the quote in this case. Now let's see if we can say a third thing about this quotation in our own words. So here we might focus on language about un-American or combative behavior from the last part of the quote. So we could say something like, we avoid discussions related to class divisions and economic inequality to the extent that many Americans view formulating issues in terms of class as antagonistic or aggressive and as potentially harmful to American values. So we even borrowed a specific phrase from the original quote, formulating issues in terms of class, and we looked at that in a bit more depth. So this idea from Mancios about talking about class might be viewed as unnecessarily combative. We essentially use some synonyms here, antagonistic or aggressive. And this idea about just class-related discussions being potentially harmful to American values is another way to examine this idea that class-related discussions might be viewed as un-American. Now let's see what happens. Here's the quote in its entirety, introduced, integrated. The black text is obviously the quote itself, and then we have our 3 sentences interpreting the quotation. So you can see here how when we put this entire framework together, our 3 sentences unpacking the single quote provided us with a healthy start on a body paragraph and gives us plenty of material to discuss when we work to connect Mancios's quote with another author's ideas. So one of the things we want to keep in mind here when we're thinking about quote selection is, again, you want to be able to say 3 different things about a quote in your own words, keeping in mind that it is always better to unpack a quote by saying several things about it in your own words than it is to bring in 3 different quotes from an author that essentially say the same thing. Keeping in mind always in academic writing, we're looking for a balance between the author's ideas, our quotations and examples that are the evidence from our authors, and our own ideas. That's part of our objective as we practice to become experienced academic writers. I hope this helps. Thank you for your time.